Welcome to the Folktale Project. This is Dan Scholz. Today we have a story from Korea, and it's a very familiar tale, and that is one of the reasons that I started the Folktale Project so many years ago, was to take a look and find those threads that seem to hold us together as humans. This story is found in so many places. A tale of a man lost in time. This is the Woodman and the Mountain Fairies. Over 500 years ago, there lived in a northern village near Pyongyang a woodcutter named Kilwi. He owned a sturdy bull that carried on its back the fuel which he daily cut on the mountains and sold on the main street of his village, at the fair, which was held every 5th day. The docile brute could carry a load of faggots and brushwood piled many feet high over his head and tied down with ropes, so that at a distance nothing but his legs were visible. This beast, although so huge, was the gentlest creature imaginable. The children were all very fond of the big fellow and were accustomed to play with him as if he were one of them, or at least like a pet dog. The reason of this was that when but a week old, the bull calf had been taken from his cow mother and brought up in the family with the girls and boys. Only the puppy dog, that also occupied the house with the young folks, was a great favorite. On a fine summer morning, Kilwi, leaving his beast behind, went up on the mountain and cut enough wood to load up and bring down on another day. His wife, as she shouted goodbye, told him to be sure and to come home in time for supper, for their eldest son had gone a-fishing, and a good string of perch was expected. Shouldering his axe, he started up the mountain path. He had to go pretty far, for near towns or cities in Korea all the timber had long since been cut away. Every year the woodmen have to search farther afield to find fuel. Arriving in the woods where there was a clearing, Kilwi prepared to wield his trusty axe. He was about to take off his big hat and outer coat and lay about him when he spied at some distance 2 fairy-like beings. They had long hair, looked very wise, and were dressed in costume of the Chow dynasty of 2,000 years ago. They sat on stones and played the game of Goban. Coming near, the woodman took a respectful attitude and looking on soon became interested in the moves of the players. So far from being at all disconcerted at the presence of a stranger, the 2 fairies seemed by eye winks to invite him to look on. Feeling quite proud to be thus honored, Kilwi, leaning his chin upon the handle of his axe, became absorbed in the game and by grew quite excited. Forgetting himself and his manners, he stretched forth his right hand to move one of the pieces. At once, the fairy nearest him gave him a crack on the fingers for his impudence and jerked Kilwi's arm away. Then, without saying a word, he took out from his wallet something that looked like a persimmon seed and put it in the woodman's mouth. After this all 3 were perfectly quiet. Hour after hour the game proceeded and the players grew more intensely interested. As for Kilwi, his eyes never winked. So hard did he look at the yellow board covered with the black and white pieces. Several times, when he thought he saw how the fairy on his right could beat in the game, or the one on his left make a better move, he felt like telling one or the other so. When, however, he tried to move his tongue, he found he could not speak or utter a cry. Somehow he felt as if he were in a dream. Yet all the time he became more and more wrapped up in the game, so that he determined to see the end of it and know which player had beaten. He forgot that the mountain spirits, there is no night or morning or passing of the hours, nor do they care about clocks or bells, because in fairyland there is no time. All the while Kilwi was leaning with his chin on the stout axe handle, holding it with both hands under his neck. He took no note of the sun or stars, daylight or darkness, and he felt no hunger. Suddenly, the timber of his axe seemed to turn to dust, and his chin fell. The next thing he knew, he had lost his support. Down went his head, and forward fell his body as he tumbled over, upsetting the checkerboard, breaking up the game, and scattering the round pieces hither and yon over the ground. Waking, as out of a sleep, and thoroughly ashamed of himself for his impoliteness, he tried to pick himself up and humbly apologize for the accident which he had caused by his own rudeness. He expected and was ready for a good scolding. But when he looked up, the fairies were gone. Nothing whatever was seen of them, or the player board, or checkers, or any signs of their having been there, except when he put his hand on the flat stones which they had used as seats. He found them warm to his touch. But where was his axe-handle, and what had happened? When he had left home, he had come straight from the barber shop, and his face was smooth and clean-shaven. Now, when he put his hand to his breast, and found that he had grown a long white beard. As for the iron axe-head, it was there, but rusty and half buried in the ground. He had worn one of the big farmer's hats, which, when turned upside down, might hold a bushel or two of turnips, and when fastened to his head, spread over his shoulders like a roof. Where could it be? He looked about him to find it, but saw only the bits of the slats inside the frame and the few scraps of what remained, for the rest had long ago rotted away. Meanwhile, he had discovered that his joints were stiff, and he felt like an old man. His clothes were a mass of rags, his hemp sandals were no more, and on both fingers and toes he had grown long nails like birds' claws. His hair had burst its top-knot string and hung down his back like a woman's, only it was grayish-white. Wondering what it all meant, Kiwi hobbled down the mountain and found that the road that ran into the main street of his village. Rocks and hills, rivers and rills were there, but what a change! Instead of the two grinning idol posts, of male and female faces carved out of trunks and trees, and sawed-out white teeth, with artificial ear-flaps of wood nailed on, such as had stood before every Korean hamlet since the days of Kija, there was a line of thick, high poles, with iron wire stretching from one to the other, and for miles into the distance. These, he found out afterward, were called lightning thread trees, or telegraph poles. In place of the rambling and sprawling three-sided thatched houses and yards, divided off with mats hung from sticks, there was a well-built and odd-looking office of painted wood, with openings through which he saw Korean young men sitting. They were dressed in strange clothes and were fingering outlandish-looking clicking instruments. His curiosity prompted him to go up and look more closely, when something bumped against his nose and nearly knocked him over. When he tried again to get closer, his face was flattened, his nose nearly broken, and his lips knocked against his teeth so that they swelled. Feeling with his hands to solve the mystery, he touched something hard, which he could yet see through. Just then, he heard a young man inside shout to him in Korean, "Here, you mountain daddy, leave that glass alone." Glass? Glass? Thought Kiwi. What was that? Yet he could not speak. He had hardly drawn a long breath when, looking down along two lines of shining iron in the street, he saw a house on wheels coming right at him. There was no horse, no donkey, no bull, no man pulling or pushing it, but overhead was a long pole, at the end of which, where it touched a string, as he thought, though it were an iron wire, was something that looked like a squirrel. It was going round and round as if turning somersaults, and seemed to be pushing the moving house along. Inside, near the same stuff which he had already heard was glass, sat a dozen or so Koreans. The whole thing, wheels and all, nearly ran over him as it thundered by, and his mouth opened in wonder, while a man on the end shouted rudely, "Hello, old goblin, where did you get your pumpkin mouth? Look out, or you'll swallow the moon. Get out of the way of the trolley." Thus did the man called conductor or guard make fun of the poor old fellow, for indeed he did look like one of the mummers who on New Year's Eve amuse or scare the children by putting on their shoulders the huge round devil heads and false faces that represent the aborigines of Korea and the goblins that once lived in the mountains. These masks are usually shaped like a melon and have cut with eyes, nose, and mouth, like those which American boys have fun with on All Hallows' Eve. This was just the trouble. The woodman, in tatters, with no topknot, long hair down his back, and a white beard flowing over his breast, leaning on a long white stick as he hobbled down the street, looked just like one of the ancient aborigines that had long ago been driven into the mountains. Nurses and old women frightened naughty children by simply mentioning their names. When one of these mountain men, odd creatures that were half savage in dress and ways, came into the town, all the children laughed and the big dogs barked, while the little ones ran away, for the sight was so unusual. Even the bulls bellowed, the donkeys balked, and the pigs squeaked as Kiel-wee came near. No wonder he was taken for a mountain granddaddy, or a bumpkin dressed up like one, for few of the city or village folks had ever really seen one of the mountain aborigines any more than they had seen tigers, that are plentiful farther away, but which only the hunters ever caught sight of. More and more bewildered, Kiel-wee wended his way further into the town. He saw that the men no longer wore topknots or chignons, nor did the lads have on the long braid down their back which showed that they were youths but not married yet. Just then some rough boys, supposing that maybe some rustic gawk had been mistaken the time of year, jeered at him and cried, "Hello, hermit! Do you think it's New Year's Eve?" Kiel-wee thought he had better ask some questions, so catching sight of a dignified-looking gentleman in black broad-brimmed hat and flowing white clothes, who was coming down the street and toward him, Kiel-wee bowed his head low, almost to the ground. As he did so, the stone put in his mouth by the fairies dropped out and his tongue was loosed. He inquired as follows, "Excellent fellow, can you tell me where there may be the wretched hut of my miserable wife and children? She was the daughter of Ji Kim, and your contemptible slave is Kiel-wee." The gentleman, whose dress showed that he was a scholar and person of rank, looked long and hard at the questioner to satisfy himself that he was not being mocked, or imposed upon by a jester, rope-dancer, sorcerer, or some such disreputable person, and then cried, "Heavens! Man, are you a beggar spirit of the mountains? Your speech sounds like the dialect of those spoken in these parts 500 years ago. In that time, such a family lived here, but the head of it, a woodcutter and fuel seller, is reported to have gone up into the mountains and was eaten up by a tiger. Yonder in the graveyard are buried 10 or more generations of his descendants. Tell me, kind sir, what has happened here since King Wang died? It was under his reign that I was born and lived in this village." Still eyeing the questioner as if expecting him to jump out of his rags and declare himself a mummer and the whole affair a joke, the kindly gentleman proceeded to give in outline the history of Korea during the previous 500 years. There had been many kings. The Tartars first, and then the Japanese had invaded the land. A great war between the Mikado's men and the Chinese had taken place. It was just over, and now people rode in cars, talked hundreds of miles over wires, and traveled over iron rails as fast as a dragon could fly, drawn by a steel horse that drank water and fed on wood and black stones that burned. In Korea, there was an era of civilization. This was too much for Kiel-wee. He now realized that he had lived 10 times longer than the average man. So hobbling over to the graveyard, he stumbled among the mounds until he found that one of his clan where the bones of his wife and children lay. Next morning, all that was seen of Kiel-wee was a mass of dust, rags, some bones, and much long white hair. Yet, when they buried him, there sprang up around and on his grave strange flowers that no one had ever seen in city or village, but which bloomed only on the high mountains. And that is the story of the Woodman and the Mountain Fairies. Story of Kiel-wee. And like I said, it's a tale that we know the broad strokes of very well. A man goes and gets himself involved with some fairies, which ends up passing time around him so quickly that everything he knows and loves is gone when he wakes up. And yet, it is very interesting to see this story told from a more modern perspective, from Korea. This is Dan Scholz for the Folktale Project. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere that you like to get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram and Threads at Folktale Project. If you'd like to help support the project, you can head over to patreon.com/folktaleproject. Or you could always just share the stories with someone you love. I do appreciate that. As always, thank you so much for listening.